today, depending on how fast I get through the preliminaries, we're going to start in on the first section of the course. But before we do that, there's some background that I thought we would need to cover, which has to do not so much with environment, but with the patterns of social inequality that exist in the United States right now. And I do that, first of all, because when I switched this class, I used to be for many years in sociology before I moved to environmental studies. And when I would teach this, pretty much the same class in sociology, those majors knew pretty much about class and race and ethnicity, and most of them knew nothing about the environment. And then when I moved over to environmental studies, the situation somewhat flipped. You guys know and care a lot about nature, but perhaps haven't had enough background in the sociology of the United States. The second reason for going through some of this is because, as you will see in a minute, the levels of inequality that we are experiencing right now in the United States are not totally historically unprecedented, but far greater than they have been ever since about 1940s or so. And those are things that we need to understand totally independently of taking this course. It's going to affect everything about your lives, your opportunities to pay for your education, to get a home loan, to get a good paying job, the quality of the infrastructure and social services that you could enjoy or not. So it's really important just to situate us in our world. And environmental inequality is only one facet of larger social inequalities. That is, as we will see in this course, the unequal exposure to environmental hazards follows roughly the same outline as unequal access to housing, jobs, education, healthcare, and so forth. So it's really important to get the bigger sociological picture. And so what we want to do is do this background work on the social inequalities in the United States, both by social class and by race and ethnicity, and the ways those things interact or intersect with each other. And by social class, what we will talk about primarily is income and wealth. There's the typical sociological way of talking about inequality by social class is to talk about three things: education, occupation, and income. And they line up. The people who have the most money typically send their children to the finest schools. They have the most schooling, and education opens up opportunities for high-paying careers and so forth. So those are strongly related to each other, maybe not perfectly, but the best data and the easiest accessible data we have has to do with income and wealth. And the difference between the income is the amount of money people earn every year, and wealth is the amount of savings or investments, stocks and bonds, the kind of accumulated bag of stuff that's hidden under somebody's bed or is deposited on Wall Street or in a bank account. So we can look at both of those. There is an economist at UC Berkeley named Emmanuel Saez. And he has a partner in Italy, Thomas Piketty. Piketty and Saez were the first ones to take a century's worth of income tax data, starting in 1913, which is the first year that the United States had a federal income tax. So for the first time, we have data on the whole national income earning population. They report to the federal government how much money they earn. And Piketty and Saez got a hold of this data and began to map out a whole century's information on incomes and therefore unequal levels of income. And we'll look at some of these pictures that they came up with. This is the first one, and it's informative, it's shocking, it's all kinds of things. I don't know if I ever told you this anecdote, but when I was a lonely, shy high school student, I would have these questions in my mind like, you know, which girl in my class do I have the biggest crush on? And there were always some, they didn't know it, of course, because I was, before I was daring enough to suggest going out on a date. But I had this fantasy, sort of like, if I were on a desert island, who would I want to be with? Who the one person? And later on, as I got older, and then I would ask questions similar, like, if I only had one piece of music to listen to again and again for the rest of my life, which one would it be? Turned out it's Bach's B minor Mass, if any of you are familiar with it. But these days, a question I ask, if I had one piece of data that restricted to one piece of data about the United States that I could look at and learn from, what would it be? And I think that this would be the one. Because this tells us a tremendous amount about our condition. And what it says is, so this is a share of national income that goes to the top 10% of the population. And it goes from 1917 to 2012. Last night I looked, and Piketty and Saez have updated to 2017, a couple of years ago. But the last few years there hasn't been too much change. A little bit of more accumulation at the top, but not too much. And so what this tells us is, you look at the 20th century in America, and roughly the 20th century divides into 3 different periods. There's a period here up to about the middle of the Second World War, 1940, in which the upper 10% had a huge share, 40 to 50% of all the national income. And of course what that means is, obviously, is that the other 90% have the other half, much less. And then something drastic happened, where their share, it never got back to 10%, like an egalitarian, everybody has the same amount. So even at their worst, they had 32, 33, 35%. They were doing pretty well, but not as well as up here. And the complex reasons why the share of national wealth increased for everybody else. It had to do with labor shortages and unionization, which allowed the working classes of America to push for higher wages. And there was also a very high rate of taxation. The top tax brackets were sometimes taxed at 90% of their, I mean, it was really, compared to what they are today, which hovers between 25-30%. Wow, it's really amazing watching those parts of trees come falling down. They're really brave people up there, you know. It's like, even though they're tied onto the tree, it's like, wow. Anyway, so this is the period of the great American middle class. This is the time when the suburbs were built. This is the time where people moved out of renting apartments and just ignore it. We're safe in here. And bought their first little house. This is when the Levittowns of America were built, where places like Daly City were built, uniform little houses that people owned for the first time. This was when people bought their first car in large numbers. Since they had a house, they would buy living room furniture. And they would buy refrigerators and washer dryers, and had all electric kitchens, and the quality of middle class life improved. And this is when most Americans thought that part of the American dream was that their children would be even better off than they were. They would pay for kids to go to college and therefore move up the social class ladder. And then around 1978, 1980, about the time that Ronald Reagan came in and began to lower the tax structure on the upper class, and other things began to happen, there is a reversion back toward greater and greater levels of inequality. And I think that, here we are, right here. We're back to the same levels as the famous eras of the robber barons. Yeah?
Can you explain the two different lines?
Oh, yes. So the ones with the little open diamond shapes, before capital gains, so that is, capital gains are basically unearned income. Like you have stocks and the value of the stock goes up. Or you have some properties, so you have real estate and the value of that, and then you bought it at one price and you sell it at a higher price. And that becomes not just regular income, it becomes capital gains. Yeah.
Would that also include inheritance, like inheriting money from?
That's a good question. I don't know. Yes, I don't know. I don't think so. Once you inherit, it appears as your stock of wealth, in addition to whatever you earn going to your job, which is a huge factor in reproducing inequalities through the generations. One of the big battles, for instance, in the French Revolution in 1789, was that we would get a more egalitarian society if there was no money inheritance. If every baby that was born really was born at the same starting line, and wherever you got to in life was a question of your talent, your drive, your abilities, as opposed to being born with a silver spoon in your mouth, as the classic saying goes. They used to say about the second George Bush president that he was born on third base and he believed that he had hit a triple. There's certain privileges which I'm sure I would hazard none of you, and certainly I didn't have, and being born into like pots of money. But yes, a good question, but I don't know how that plays out. This is taking the top 10% and splitting it into the top 1%, 4 to 5, and 5 to 10. And what it tells you is, so this line is the share of the top 5 to 10%. This is the line for the top 5 to 1%, and this is the line for the 1%. So what this graph tells you is, yes, some parts of the 10% improved a little bit, but really what accounts for this U shape is money that went to the top 1%. So the higher you go, the higher the skew becomes. This is the top 1/10 of 1%. Now we're talking a few 10,000 families that really have big bucks. And the same share. This is wealth instead of income. And what it shows you is the top 1% have about over 40% of the wealth of the country. This is the top 1/10 of 1%. So the same pattern holds again and again. And then we move on to a different kind of research, which I think is also very interesting. And this was done by Norton and Ariely, two economists. And the question they had was, what is the difference between the actual distribution of wealth in the country versus what people believe to be the distribution, and then people's imaginary ideal of a good society. So let's take a look at this. So this is Americans a few years ago, and it's kind of rough because it's cut into just 5 blocks. The top 20%, 20, 20, 20, and the bottom 20. So it's too rough to give us a sense of how much of the top 20% is really dominated by the top 1%. But it's instructive anyway to look at this because let's look at the ideal. The ideal, so Americans were asked, how would you, in a good society, if America was at its best, how would you distribute wealth? And Americans aren't like hardcore communists, obviously, so they didn't say the top 20% should have 20%. They said, well, we think the top 20% should have about 32% of everything. And then the next 20% should have about 21%. And the next 20%, the middle, should have about their fair share, 20%. But even down here, like the bottom 20% should have about 11% of everything. And then they were asked the second question, which was, okay, what do you think is actually going, what do you think is going on? And they said, well, we think that the top 20% has 58% of everything. And then increasingly smaller shares. And then they said, okay, now we're going to look at federal statistics and actually map out what the actual distribution is. And the actual distribution of the top 20% has 84% of everything. And then the second 20% has about 10%. And the third middle 20% has maybe 4%. And the bottom 40% have nothing. They don't even appear on the graph. So I thought that was kind of an interesting piece of research. There's so much inequality that people have no clue on a daily basis. In fact, I saw a survey a couple years ago that said that 19% of Americans believe that they're in the top 1%. And another 19% believe that they'll get into the 1% sometime in their lives. It's a very comforting thing to think, but yes. Sorry?
How recent is this?
This? I could look it up for you within the last 10 years. Yeah.
What would be like approximately the cutoff for like how much money someone has to be in the top 20% or the bottom 20%?
I can't give you that number right off. The question is, what do these numbers correspond to? I could look it up and send that information around. It's available for what it takes to be in the top 10%, what it takes to be in the top 1%. And I think that would be interesting. I'll look it up and send out an email to everybody. Was there somebody else? Yeah.
There was like 4 figures back, and I was wondering.
Yeah.
That one.
This one?
Yeah. Is this per individual or is this per like family?
I believe it's whoever is based on income tax filings, so they can be both, for the household or for individuals. There are times that people file as individuals. Sometimes they file as couples, married couples. Yeah.
Is there something that changed when there's like that low line of their incomes and then it starts like going up?
Yeah.
Did the tax rate change?
Yeah. Oh, yes. The tax rate changed dramatically. I mean, there used to be these very, very high levels of taxation for the super wealthy. And it was during the Reagan era that the first significant reductions happened. And they've continued. Look at the income cut, the tax cut last year that happened, significantly benefiting corporations and the top brackets of the income. Everybody got maybe a little bit, but they got a disproportionate share of the $1 trillion tax cut that was passed by Congress last year. And of course, one of the things, I'll say this preliminarily, that one of the ways that this appears is if you take all of the national income, like the gross domestic product, and like every year, every one of you gets up or will and go to work, and you will produce gross domestic product, either making things or providing services, and sum that up, and that's the total economic activity of the nation. And taxes are that part, whether those taxes are individual or corporate taxes, which are withdrawn from individual consumption, so that you can take the federal and state and local taxes, like government taxes, and that is some fraction of the total national income. The other fraction goes to yourself. You get to spend it however you want, but the taxable fraction goes for collective consumption. So that goes for schools, for libraries, for the military, for foreign affairs, for environmental protection, for infrastructure, keeping up subways and trains and so forth. And so if you shrink the tax dollars, it shrinks the proportion that goes into collective public consumption and increases the amount that goes into everybody's private pockets. And then people get to spend that however they want, but the super wealthy get to buy big homes in gated communities and have their own private pools and their own maybe even private airplanes to fly them here and there, so that they don't have to struggle to go through the TSA lines and all that. Yeah.
So has the tax system been relatively the same since the Reagan administration?
There have been a series of tax cuts since then as well. And there have been also some increases, so it's kind of, there was a big cut then, and even in the late Reagan period, there was so little money coming in that he had to raise taxes a bit. And then it kind of waffled, and then we've had another huge plunge since then. Yeah?
I pulled up the numbers on what it takes to be in the top 1%.
Yes.
People want to get a picture.
Yes.
So it varies a lot state by state. Stand up so you can hear me better. Varies a lot state by state, but on average, the threshold, so the lowest income you could make to be in the top 1% across the U.S. is $389,436. This is in 2013, so not exactly today, but that's the average household, like a family or all the earners in the same household, that is in the top 1% makes $1.15 million annually. But it depends a lot state to state. So if you live in New Mexico, you can make $231,000 and be in the top 1%. But if you live in Connecticut, you need to have $660,000 a year to be in the top 1%.
Would you look up the 1/10 of 1%?
Yeah, I'll look that up too.
And the 1/100th of 1%. We want to know how those filthy rich people really live. Not that I'll ever see anything like that. Yeah.
I was going to ask about, so that period between, like, say, 1940s and maybe 1970s.
Yeah.
There was like a relatively higher tax rate across
Yeah.
both like conservative and progressive governments.
Yeah.
But was there a consensus that was what was needed in America?
There appears to, I was only a kid then, so, I wasn't following politics until I got to college in 1966. So this is all, just kind of listening to my elders. But there seems to have been a consensus that there were plenty of Republicans in the House and the Senate. Dwight Eisenhower was a Republican president. So there seemed to have been a national consensus that the United States as a whole, as a nation, would benefit from not having extremes of wealth. And that it was a good thing. And certainly for manufacturing, the fact that families could afford to move from renting to owning, and could afford a car, and could afford to put the kids in the car and go on a 2-week vacation to the national parks, and could buy a barbecue for the backyard, was something that, and a lot of American infrastructure was built at that time. That was when the national interstate highway system was built. I remember times before then that my family would go from Kansas City to Colorado, and you would be on 2-lane roads all the way through Kansas and Colorado, and very dangerous. So it was a miracle when the 4-lane divided highway system was constructed, allowing vast movement. Cities grew, suburbs grew, houses were built. It created, when you create a large mass base of consumption, you create an engine for economic growth, which benefits the country as a whole. Of course, there were people who were left out of that. There were pockets of poverty in Appalachia. Certainly the African American population was being discriminated against in education, housing, employment. So the affluence or the semi-affluence wasn't uniformly offered to the nation as a whole, but tens of millions of people had that kind of. Stop looking at the thing. All right, let's get back. Okay, where were we? Okay, so the United States looks pretty bad compared to many other countries. Let's see if I can find you. People ever heard of the Gini index? Gini, measure of inequality. So if you here's the CIA, helpfully gives us the Gini indexes of countries around the world. And so where does the United States rank? It started the worst countries with the most inequality. This is starting from the least inequality. So here you see places like Norway, Germany, Finland, Iceland, and some of these countries like my homeland, Hungary, look pretty good on inequality because everybody's miserable. So you can have high levels of equality when the whole country's so poor that nobody has anything, but you work up and you go through Denmark and France and Switzerland and Australia and Austria. The thing that ought to look at it, where is the United States compared to other advanced, wealthy, industrialized nations? And you keep going, and we're now at, it started out at 156, 57, and we're working our way up through, now we're going past Bosnia, Mongolia, Sierra Leone, Algeria. Where is it? Did I pass it already? Not yet. Okay, there's Uganda, Angola, Chad, and there it is, number 39. Getting near the bottom of the international rankings. So, not necessarily a good place to be. And let's get back to our PowerPoint. Where were we? Oh, we are here. Okay. And in the last few years, the situation has not improved. The world's richest 500, and this is 2017, increased their wealth by $1 trillion. Oh, here's Jeff, the world's richest individual. It goes back and forth. Sometimes it's Bill Gates. There's a handful of people that hand back and forth the gold medal for having more than anybody else. I really don't know. What does a person do with like $8 billion? I mean, after you've had your 10th like fantastic home and you have your private jets, and like the president has a gold toilet seat in his residence. And, I mean, why do you need a gold toilet seat? It's just amazing. Oxfam came out with this number last year. 8th richest men in the world have as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion. So, I mean, the level is just intense. And of course, the flip side of that is poverty. Well, there's two flip sides. There's the American middle class, which all the Piketty and Saez data shows that once you get below 90%, that people are either just treading water, that their real income is about the same, or sliding down somewhat in terms of their ability to afford things. And then in the bottom, well, you've got 50 million people living in food insecure households. In terms of child poverty, here's the United States compared to other advanced industrialized nations, a higher child poverty rate than any other of these nations. But you can't talk about hunger. So during the Bush administration, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, stopped putting the word hunger in their reports. And they started putting in very low food security. And the first time I saw that, I thought about like Charles Dickens, like early industrialization in like England, tremendous poverty, and in the Dickens thing, say, I'm going to bed hungry. Mom, I'm hungry. Well, Americans don't say that anymore, I thought. They probably say, Mom, I'm suffering from low food security tonight. Not likely. But euphemisms, I suppose, make things better. So there was this gentleman, Professor Philip Alston, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. And I put up the URL in case you want to see his report. He visited the United States 2 years ago and wrote a report about the level of poverty that exists in this country. And I won't take the time to go through it, but it was a very, very stark report. Once you have poverty at this level, well, even if you ignore it, even if you say food insecurity rather than hunger, and Americans do ignore it. Like if you go back to the 1950s, I told you a moment ago in black communities at that time and in certain pockets like in Appalachia, tremendous poverty. But nobody paid any attention. People bought their televisions and the television brought them images of happy middle-class white families, sitcoms. And in 1962, I believe, a book was written by Michael Harrington called The Other America, which basically said, look, not everybody's into the gains of the middle class. And everybody was like, shocked. And that shock again happened in the late 60s. In 67, 68, a series of riots broke out in American inner cities. Almost every big city in America saw race riots taking place. And it's on television now. And suddenly you see poor black communities depicted on TV. And there was a special, everybody was pretty disturbed by it. And a report was written called the Kerner Commission Report, which talked about two Americas, that there is a white America, which is middle class or better, and then there is a black America, which is suffering in the inner cities. And again, Americans are shocked. And then Americans are shocked again in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. And you see on New Orleans, people who had cars, people who buy airplane tickets, flew out of the city before it was submerged by the hurricane. But the very high population of poor African Americans, no ways to leave the city, end up at the Superdome, end up at the convention center, in dire conditions. Again, Americans are shocked that there is poverty in America, and then we forget about it again. I put this up here. It's a book that just came out by Walter Scheidel. He's a historian at Stanford University who asked this one question, like, once a country is in deep, deep inequality, how does it ever change? How do you get a more egalitarian society? And here is the summary of what he said. It's almost universally true that violence has been necessary to ensure the redistribution of wealth at any point in time. So what he's ending up saying is major wars, revolutions, riots, plagues, when a lot of the population dies because of infectious diseases, are historically in our society been the only ways that you begin to undo inequalities. And that's a pretty scary story, right? So it's hard to undo. And the question is, what are the consequences? Well, most of this class is going to be about the environmental or ecological consequences. But the consequences are individual, they're consequences for the whole nation, consequences for civilization. So before we move on very quickly, for the individual, Elizabeth Warren, who was a professor before she became a politician, did some economics research asking this question: why do people fall into bankruptcy? Is it because they're profligate, they're like party too much, they spend their money too easily? Her research findings were that Americans slide into bankruptcy and slide down the class ladder because their incomes cannot keep up with the costs of everyday life. Healthcare, housing, so forth. So most Americans have no savings. They live paycheck to paycheck. They spend most of that paycheck on housing and on food and clothing, the essentials. And if there's any kind of catastrophe, and everybody has catastrophe in their lives, they have car accidents, people get ill. It's one of the big struggles about this whole question of covering pre-existing conditions. Before you die, you're going to have a pre-existing condition. It's 100% guaranteed. And those things are costly. The healthcare system is completely irrational. So most Americans, because the level of income is low, their level of security is low, and there's anxieties about having enough income for basic needs, for housing, healthcare, things like that. So inequality has consequences for each individual and each family. It has consequences for the nation. Again, GDP, you can divide it into two pieces. That piece that stays, that earnings that stay in people's own bank accounts, and those part of national earnings which are collected for collective consumption. And that collective consumption goes for schools, and it goes for infrastructure. And any one of you who's ever traveled, like for instance in Europe, and gone to a place like London or Paris or Vienna or Prague, sees what a functioning infrastructure will look like. Subways, cheap transportation, easy to get here. As the United States has basically starved the collective consumption sphere, which is why people complain about infrastructure aging, wearing out. You read about the subway system in New York City, complete catastrophe, and so forth. Libraries are being cut, pool hours are being closed. In Santa Cruz, a number of pools, public pools, have either closed or access to them has been reduced. And then of course there's public poverty. Last year I was on the board of the University of California Press, and we met 6 times up in Oakland. So I had to drive up. The meeting starts at 9 a.m. I had to drive up the night before, stay at a hotel. And every one of the times when I left the hotel and drove to Oakland, every underpass, where a major highway goes over a city street, tent cities, which hadn't been there 20, 30 years ago when I used to live in Oakland. And of course we have our huge tent city right now that mushroomed overnight behind Ross, by the river as well. So the bottom rung is homelessness, where people are left with nothing but tents. So on that level, things are bad. And then I found this paper. This may be the most frightening paper that I've read in the last 2 years. Inequality and the collapse or sustainability of societies. And this is, it's just such a mind-blowing essay based on, it's not an essay, it's actually empirical research. The authors, these 3 authors, asked this question, if we look at societies collectively over many years, centuries, that have collapsed, what are the basic things that cause societies to fundamentally stop functioning? And the answer they came up with, well, the word inequality is in there. What does inequality have to do with it? So it's an interaction between abusing and overusing the environment. That is, using too many resources, having too many toxic effluents. But that by itself will not collapse a society. What collapses society is that there's such a huge inequality. There's a small, very powerful elite. And those elites not only have wealth, but they have political power. And they are living such good lives. They have been able to isolate themselves in their own little enclaves. They have not only the nicest homes, but they have the nicest communities. And in the U.S., we have gated communities where people kind of withdraw into, and they have armored cars, possibly with darkened windows. You can isolate yourself from social chaos. And so the article argues that it is fundamentally the inequality, the political power that's wielded by the wealthiest, who are insulated from the worst impacts and are privileged and are having a good life, and they resist change until it's too late, until the society collapses. So in a way, inequality makes whole societies as an organism unable to respond meaningfully and rationally to a crisis that's generated somehow, and things fall apart. So inequality hard to undo, according to this historian, and has potentially dire consequences. So where are we? Now we have to, well, that's social class. And now we have to look at the intersection of class, race, and ethnicity, because so much of the environmental justice research that we're going to be looking at is some combination of both race and poverty in terms of people's exposure to unequal amounts of toxic hazards. And so it's worth looking at not just social class, but the United States, as we know, is a deeply racialized society and has been, it has been since its very beginnings. It has been since Europeans invaded and took over the land of Native Americans and exploited them, took their resources, sometimes enslaved them. And of course then the whole history of the U.S. based on slave labor being brought in from Africa. And eventually other ethnicities, Asians coming to the United States to work here, as well, Southern Europeans, Jews, Italians. So ethnicity is not just we now talk about white, but until recently there was no such category. It was also like the Ukrainians and Russians and Italians and Poles, so forth. And so the United States has been built up through waves of immigration, but it's also led to waves of difference, discrimination, exploitation, and so forth. So, and the patterns are really worth looking at because they matter for the research we're going to be talking about in a couple of weeks. So here are some ways that I can show you that there is an intersection or interaction between race and social class. This is from the 2000 census, so it's a little bit out of date, but the patterns persist. Looks at median family income and compares it to people living in central cities versus large suburbs, and then looks at everybody all together, and then breaks it out into non-Hispanic, white, black, and Hispanic. These are the categories. The census's ways of dividing the population into racial and ethnic groups changes every 10 years. It makes research very difficult. I mean, it used to be back in 1950, it was like white, not white. That was the only categories. Then they introduced the notion of Spanish surname. That's how they started talking first about the Hispanic population. And then they began to add a category for Asians, and then Asian Americans began to be divided between Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Pacific Islanders, so on and so forth. And now we have a proliferation of categories. Again, changes every time. But in 2000 census, what we see is, well, where are the highest income categories? They're in the suburbs, non-Hispanic whites, around, at that time, 70,000 median household income. And the lowest, central cities, African Americans, Hispanics, at one-third of the income. So huge discrepancies, and what you see is a complex set of interactions between class and race. And here is another demonstration of the same interaction. So let me talk to you about, this is a piece of research that some students and I did quite a long time ago now, where we took Los Angeles County and we divided LA County into census tracts. Census tracts are roughly 5,000 to 7,000 people. It's the smallest unit that the U.S. Census uses for, they visit households, they sample households, then they aggregate data into census tracts. LA County has about 1,500 census tracts. And for each one of them, we took the median household income, which ranged from 0 to 150,000 or higher. So these are really wealthy census tracts where we have very high income. And down here are census tracts that are, well, this is sort of low, medium to lower and lower, and these are very poor tracts down here. And then on the other dimension, we took the percent of both Latino and African American, what percentage of the population combines these two groups, who are economically, in LA County, the most disadvantaged on average. And they range from 0%, so these are all white census tracts here, to 100% or near 100%. These are all predominantly or overwhelmingly minority communities. And if you look at this, is a scatter plot then of this 1,500 dots, 1,500 census tracts. And what it shows you is this great giant hole here. So there are no when you look here, like look at 50% minority here. The last dot you see is here, around 70,000. And from here, big empty space. So what that tells you is that the wealthiest census tracts in LA County were the ones that are overwhelmingly white, and where the communities where people of color live are overwhelmingly poor to lower middle class. So interaction effects that are very, very powerful. Let's see, where are we now? I'm going to skip that. And then finally, if you want to study any of this, the New York Times usefully, a couple years ago, created a map mapping every city, every block, as it says, and it's, oh, sorry, let's get this. It's the whole United States, and you can zoom in. Like let's go to the Bay Area, which is what we know best, and then you. Okay, well, let's look at Santa Cruz. Oh, okay, so here's San Francisco, the East Bay, the South Bay, San Jose, Santa Cruz County. And within Santa Cruz County, each individual census tract, it shows you the ethnographic breakdown. But you can also look at income. There's other kinds of census data. So when and if, when you write your paper, let's say you grew up somewhere in the LA area and you find an environmental conflict to write about, and you want to just start with like, what are the basic demographics of the region where I grew up? This would be an excellent place to really, I mean, it used to be for the U.S. Census that you would have to go to the library and take out these big volumes and go through them. And eventually you could sort of find them on hard disks. And now it's like there, ready for the taking. And a very, very important resource. So let's see how we're doing. Okay, I think we can go on. So I'm done with this particular portion. I mean, I really thought it was essential before we get to environmental, to just take a look at the basic demographic facts of our situation. And if you're looking for that one piece of data to take on the desert island with you, I recommend the one that I selected. I think it's very, very powerful. So I'm going to go on for a little bit. My purpose, my intention is to go every day till about 11 o'clock and then open up for questions and discussions. Maybe I should pause here because we have a pretty radical departure in topic. So are people want to ask any more questions or comment on this at this point? No? Yeah.
So was the huge rise in inequality and starting in the 80s, was that solely because of Reagan and his policies, or were there other things happening too?
A big one was the taxation policy. Reagan also undertook to try to break labor unions. I don't know how many of you ever studied that particular period. I have to keep in mind that you guys were, what was the phrase? Just a twinkle in your father's eye at the time, something like that. You didn't exist, right? Not yet. So one of the things that Reagan did was he carried out a lockout against the air traffic controllers' labor union. And it was like a high-profile anti-union effort to fire all the unionized air traffic controllers and to hire non-unionized replacements for them. And labor unions had been in decline for decades already. And they were pretty strong in the 50s and 60s, and they had already started getting weakened. And labor unions were largely responsible for, through organized strikes, to get higher and higher incomes, paid medical leave, health insurance, paid vacations, things like that. There used to be this bumper sticker people would have on their cars, something like, thank the unions for the 2-day weekend, right? And we'll get into that later when we look at the struggle for the 10-hour day and the 8-hour day, and the labor movement of the 19th century, which was really instrumental in giving us the 40-hour work week. But they not only shortened working hours and produced safer factories, but they also fought for higher wages. And so once you begin the shrinkage of the labor unions and a larger percentage of the labor force is non-unionized, you begin to lose collective power to fight for decent wages. So what Reagan did at that time with the attack on the air traffic controllers union was to signal that the federal government was turning against unions, and it accelerated the deunionization. So now what we've got left in the United States is largely public sector unions, teachers and people like that. And so that was a factor in decrease. And then I think there were certain kind of economic pressures on corporations to constantly increase the rate of profit. And the way to increase the rate of profit, there's only a certain number of ways to do that. You get a larger market share, but you can also underpay for natural resources, and you can cut wages as much as possible. So part of what happened in terms of the wage decrease was globalization. A lot of corporations moved their products overseas. I remember, just as an anecdote, one of my son's friends came over. They took a hike, and father comes pick him up, and the father works for Apple. And he looked kind of bleary-eyed, and I said, we were chatting, waiting for the kids to come home. I didn't know anything about the guys. What do you do? I work for Apple. What kind of stuff do you make? I can't tell you because it's a secret product we're developing. He then tells me he just returned from China. And so, how long were you there? Like 2 days. What? I mean, you flew all the way? Well, they buy a bed for him. He sleeps on the way over. And is there for 2 days. Went to Foxconn, which is where they were manufacturing whatever secret Apple product he couldn't tell me about. And he's sitting there in my living room wondering out loud, like unbelievable. He says, you go there and there's like 80,000 plus people making these products at Foxconn. And they're just starting to make this new product, and like basically somebody, rings a bell or blows a whistle, and they all start manufacturing, and a few hours later, a few sample finished products plop out at the end of the line. Somebody blows a whistle again, everybody goes on break, eats a sandwich, smokes a cigarette, and while the engineers from Apple test the product. Quality, is it working well, is it doing it? And if it is, then they start manufacturing. And he was just wondering out loud. It was sort of like, he thought of himself as sort of like the modern pharaoh who could get all that labor power together to build the pyramids. When you can take 80,000 people and make them work in concert, in unison, to produce a product. at at wages that are so low that Foxconn had a suicide problem for the workers. How do they solve the suicide problem? Well, they upped the wages a little bit, but they also put nets outside their windows to catch the people as they throw themselves out. So globalization was a way of reducing American wages by either actually moving overseas or threatening to move overseas with major manufacturing. So there's a whole process of deindustrialization that happened. So it's not only the lack of union jobs, but the lack of well-paying factory jobs. And America is then moving toward a more service economy where people do food, healthcare, things like that. Service typically pays lower wages than, and so it wasn't just a taxation, but a whole series of things that happened that shrunk Americans' wages. At the same time that you have a new industrial sector, you have high tech, you have there's a tremendous amount of new products, innovation, money, venture capital, all being, and so you go to San Francisco now or Silicon Valley, parts of San Jose, which are just sort of, money pouring out of people's pores, fine restaurants being open, the price of housing totally going out. So, that happened as well. Anytime you have a new industrial, innovative, it was like when cars, were the new thing, but this is like a new industrial revolution that took place that produces new wealth of a tremendous. And that's why you guys come in here and every single person, when they first sit down, takes out their little phones, and, because that's what everyday life is about these days, right? But yes, excellent question. Yes?
Does the New York Times school, does it allow you to compare wealth and demographics, or is it just...
Compare what?
Wealth, like class, does it have class data?
Oh yes, it has income data. The census has all kinds of income data. It has the income, it has whether you're renters or not, how much you pay for housing, all kinds of economic data, as well as the racial and ethnic data as well, levels of education, things like that. Yeah, it's an amazing resource. Any other comments or questions at this point? Yeah, who? Somebody? Oh, yeah, sorry.
You mentioned that the Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel.
Yeah.
I was just curious, you were also mentioning like shrinking collective consumption and more disparity and quality. I was just wondering, do you think that violence is the answer? Do you think that like more legislation could mitigate the inequality problems? Like, what do you think is your solution?
That was a really depressing book to read because if okay, when I was 9 years old, I was a Hungarian 9-year-old living through the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. And so I saw firsthand what violent protest looks like. And I saw rows of Russian tanks coming into Budapest and shooting up the place. And people throwing Molotov cocktails at the tanks and people dying. So no, I don't, it's, if that's what it takes, that's the only way to do it, that's pretty distressing. But I don't think that's the only, I think that book is overstated. It's certainly true that major wars, major epidemics which reduce the amount of labor that's available. Like in the Middle Ages, there were these major epidemics in Europe that killed like 25% of the population. The wages of everybody else went up because you need people to work the farms, right? And revolutions are great levelers in that particular way. I remember a few years ago, the first time I ever went to Paris, I went to a museum which had a history of the French Revolution. And I walked, every room had a little screen with some professor lecturing about that particular moment in the revolution. And one of them, and you could push a button, you wanted it in French, German, or English. and he's lecturing about the period of what's known as the Terror period of the French Revolution. And he said something like, you know, everybody talks about the French Revolution being so violent, but only 30,000 people had their heads cut off. And I'm sitting there like, what? I'm not sure that the word only and 30,000 and head cut off really belong in the same sentence. Not in my world. And so, yes, the violence does a lot, but it destroys people's lives. And, you know, one would think that something less drastic, like tax reform, would be, you know, maybe not as dramatic a correction, but, you know, I mean, but in American history, I mean, the war and the Great Depression certainly did a lot to go from here to here. And then over time, slowly, you know, inequality reasserts itself. So I don't think any of us yearn to have another Great Depression or to have a world war to kind of straighten things out again. But sound tax policy certainly seems like it could make some headway. And, you know, more money redirected from the private sector into collective consumption, I think would do all of us a lot of good. So, excellent question, though. Yeah, I think solutions short of massive breakdown of everyday order. You know, it's like I have pictures of what my grade school looked like during the revolution, and of course nobody's going to school, and there's a gun in the street, like a cannon, parked right in front, and pictures of people going to buy bread at the local bakery, walking by dead bodies that are covered up with lime and newspapers before they're removed. I really don't think any of us want to go in that direction if there's an alternative. Okay, now it's gotten to be 11. So what should I do? Should I go on or should we just talk? I'll show you a few more slides. And
I'll make a quick announcement that the most recent study on income, that I just quoted a little while ago, for 2013, is actually a 2018 version of what it takes to be in the top 1% or the top 0.01%. And I just posted it to Canvas in a folder called Supplemental Materials, so if you want to see that. But just as a sneak peek, the average income of someone in the top 0.01% in the United States today is $32,217,855.
what 32 million gives you what?
That's the average income of someone in the top 0.01% in the United States as of last year. The threshold to get into, if you want to get into the top 0.01%, and you want to just get into the club, you need 90.7 million per year. Another interesting graph that's in here basically shows regionally how this is distributed over time, and it shows that this most recent bulge in wealth is all in the West. So you might think about technology and oil and gas and the particular industries that are driving that inequality at this particular period of time. So check it out.
Wow, professors don't get to that 9 million, you know. Average or mediocre players in the NBA, I think, are probably getting close to it, right? Yeah. There are people who are too injured to play who are still getting 5 million this year. So like, really? Sign me up. My voice is failing me. I can't lecture anymore, but I want my income. More. Anyway, it's just sort of irrational. I mean, you get these millions of dollars for throwing a ball into a basket. Really? That's kind of strange. Okay, well, we'll go on for a few minutes and then we'll, this will be more like an introduction to what I'll be talking about on Tuesday. So for Tuesday, you should definitely make sure that you have read Solon's and also read Jared Diamond and also Scott's selection from Scott, because I'll start talking about that more substantively next time. But let me just sort of frame where we're going. So again, this strange word, meta-narrative. My contention is that environmental inequality, because inequality is all, in the last 8,000 years, been fundamental to all human societies, that inequality is not just in political power, not just in status, not just in wealth, but also the hoarding of environmental goods and the avoidance of environmental bads. And actually, we're talking about two meta-narratives. The grandest one of all is looking at all of human history through the lens of environmental inequality. And then, so we'll do a little bit of that next couple of sessions. But mostly what we're interested in is our own society, urban industrial capitalism, seen through the lens of environmental inequality. And so the bigger one, the first meta-narrative, all stages, I'm going to use the simplified version of stages of human history, hunter-gatherers, then the beginning of agricultural societies, primarily through the end of feudalism, which, I mean, there's no particular, it's not like the end of a ball game, where the clock runs down. History happens a little slower than that, but certainly in the middle of the 19th century, there's a transition from feudalism to industrial capitalism, and our primary attention will be to that. And that's why the smaller meta-narrative has to do with environmental inequality in the contemporary world, and that's what is going to be our focus. In greater detail, start out with hunter-gatherers, the last egalitarian societies. Look at the birth of agricultural societies. This is other new term, sedentism, which emphasizes that one of the characteristics of this transition is people stopped being mobile. They stopped moving around in a kind of an annual trip following food sources to living in permanent settlements, and looking at the transition, like how did this happen, why did this happen, looking at the environmental justice aspects of early agricultural societies, and then turning to modern industrial society, where we're going to focus both on what happened to early modernity in Europe, that is the early industrial city and the factory system, and then what happened in the rest of the world, because Europe couldn't undertake modernization and industrialization without at the same time militarily invading and occupying the rest of the world and exploiting those other societies for natural resources, for labor, with dire consequences for people in the Americas, people in Africa, people in Asia as well. So Europe becomes the center of a world system in theoretical terms, and so we need to look at that as well. So our first look will be at hunter-gatherers, and I found this useful little chart yesterday, so I'll clean it up and make a stronger copy. But so let me show this to you. So this is in Scott's book, fantastic book. Our society is blessed with brilliant, brilliant scholars. So James Scott, Against the Grain. I know most of you will not read anything beyond what I assign to you. In fact, some of you will not read some of that either. I hope that's not true, but I know factually it's probably true. But in case you ever want to go deeper into any of this stuff, I will be showing you how to do that. And this would be Against the Grain is the name of the book, just came out last year. And this particular graph shows you that, okay, so it says the appearance of anatomically modern humans about 200,000 years before BCE, before the Common Era, which is the year 0, the beginnings of the Christian era, often referred to as the Common Era. 660,000 years ago, evidence of people dispersing from Africa. 12,000 years ago, scattered evidence of sedentism. So the first evidence that there were semi-permanent small settlements. People weren't just purely nomadic, but and that obviously had to do with, okay, so when is the end of the last ice age? About 20,000 years ago? So we're talking this about 14,000 years ago, the first evidence of people kind of staying local. And that's because as the Earth kind of warms out of the last glacial period, conditions get very favorable. There's lots of vegetation, lots of berries, a lot of animals become very available. And the more foodstuffs become locally available, the less incentive people have to be nomadic and have an annual cycle of traveling. So that's first evidence, but it really doesn't stabilize till about 5000 BCE, because what it says is, okay, so here is this period. Anyone heard of the Younger Dryas period? Okay, so a little bit of world geology. So the Earth comes out from the last glacial maximum, gets warmer, 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 but it's not a smooth curve, it's jagged. And there is a period, it's called the Younger Dryas. Dryas is a type of glacial lily. And so people date things by looking at like spores and seeds in glacial ice. You can dig down and you can periodize. And so the Younger Dryas is known as, that's the name of it, because there is a sudden proliferation of this particular kind of plant in the ice cores. And what it shows is that about 13,000 years ago, as the Earth is warming, suddenly there's a huge plunge back to glacial conditions. The whole northern hemisphere drops about 10 degrees centigrade, stays cold for 1,000 years, and then warms up again and proceeds. Now, I looked at the literature this morning to try to say, okay, what's the latest about what explains? Everybody knows that it's happened. What's not clear is why it happened. The most common theory is that there was a giant glacial melt lake where Canada is right now, because there were these huge glaciers during the Ice Age, and as they melt, there were these ice dams so that the melt couldn't immediately flow into the ocean, but collects as this immense, cold, clear lake. I think it's called Lake Agassiz by the geologists. And at some point, that dam breaks, and all that water pours into the North Atlantic. And what's left is the Great Lakes right now. The 5 Great Lakes is what's left of that immense lake. And as that water pours down, it interrupted what's known as the thermohalide circulation, which is this giant ocean circulation that brings warmth from the tropics up and deposits it in the atmosphere and warms Europe and warms North America. And then, once it lets go of heat, then it cools down again. And all this non-salty water that poured into the North Atlantic stops for a while this circulation, throwing the northern hemisphere into this cold period. I saw another theory that had to do with a giant meteor that struck the Earth and darkened the sky and therefore cut down on sunlight and caused. So the scientists are not totally in agreement, but the thing did happen. And one of the things that Scott says is that the reason why he put this in here, right here, is that the settlements started here. People started kind of, being in place. But during the Younger Dryas, they became nomadic again. There was a period where they were moving towards settlement. They abandoned that because game became more scarce, and so forth. And they went back to a more hunter-gatherer lifestyle. But then things stabilize, scattered evidence of domesticated plants and livestock, evidence of domestication of founder crops. Now these are, the first ones were wheat and barley. So one of the important things is like people slowly learn to domesticate a bunch of crops, also animals, goats and sheep first. But barley and wheat were especially important according to Scott because they allowed the formation of local taxation. You know, when you grow stuff like potatoes or root crops, they mature at different times. They're also invisible largely. They're underground until you need them. But things like wheat and barley, they all kind of ripen at the same time, and they're above ground and they're very visible. They have to be cut and threshed and collected. And so there's perfect crops for the beginning of taxation, where the local government officials, the local elites would come by and take some of everybody's crop, and therefore begin to hoard and accumulate a surplus. So the founding crops, and then evidence of further settlements. And so about by 5,000 BCE or 7,000 years ago, you have the relatively stable communities in the Middle East, in the Fertile Valley area. You've got the formation of what looks like central governing houses, temple-like places where grain could be stored, ceremonial places, walls around cities, showing that there's kind of a defensive structure against warfare, and so on. So there's like a 7,000-year transition until we get to the formation of these early agricultural states. The places where we're going to be looking, and the essence of what we want to look at is the difference in the daily lives and the experience of people who lived in hunter-gatherer societies versus what life was like in the early agricultural states. And the works that we're going to be depending on, first of all, Marshall Solins, one of the selections I asked you to read, a very famous book called Stone Age Economics. Marshall Solins, one of the truly brilliant scholars, professor at the University of Chicago, an economic anthropologist. Everything I've ever read by him totally blows my mind. I just think there's some people who play music and they're like, oh, if I could only play like X. And scholars have the same thing. You read somebody's work and say, man, if I was only able to think and write like that guy, wow, unbelievable. Marshall Solins, one of those guys. We'll look at some works from this great leveler, Scheidel, Scott's Against the Grain. I also want to tap into William Cronin, one of the people who founded the profession of environmental history, wrote this fantastic little book called Changes in the Land, which is about Native American life in New England, both before and after the arrival of the Europeans, and how they thought about land, how they used resources, and then how that was transformed under the pressure of these invaders from another land. And if you like more fiction, I would recommend this book. Kim Stanley Robinson, probably the best sci-fi writer currently alive and writing. And this book, which she wrote a couple years ago, Shaman, is his research-based but fantasy life of what human life was like right at the end of the last ice age. Brilliant and wonderful work if you like to do it that particular way. Okay, at this point I want to stop. Any further comments and questions? Yes?
What reading did we do again?
What?
What reading